Okay, thanks for clicking there. I'm Mike Hartman of the Giving Review and the Capital Research Center, which will be relevant in a minute. And the other guy is Robert Stilson, who is a colleague of mine at the Capital Research Center, where he is a senior research analyst. And you need to know that we both have law degrees. I don't know if we're certainly not both practicing lawyers, but we both have law degrees. So don't click away yet, but that might be something that's helpful to know. Robert is also the author, and this is why we are talking to him today, of a recent, I think, four-part series on the Capital Research Center site. There'll be a link in the materials or the write-up about fiscal sponsorship. Uh, Robert, what is fiscal sponsorship?
Fiscal sponsorship, it's a contractual arrangement, so it can mean a lot of different things, but I think the best way to understand it is a group that operates, it does not have its own tax exempt status from the IRS, so it operates as a project of a group that does. And so you get a lot of the benefits of tax exemption, which we can talk about, but essentially, we talk about fiscally sponsored projects. We're talking about a group that's operating underneath, in some manner, an established nonprofit.
When were they created?
Um, the earliest, I mean, the consensus I found in my research was that the first recognized fiscal sponsorship, a lot of people date to 1959. So there was a group at the time. It had a different name. Today it's TSNE, Third Sector New England, although I think they've shortened that officially in the last few years. 1959 was the first I could find.
Are they characterizable as something that was created by like elected policymakers?
Yeah, no, I don't think they are. This is something that developed, like I said, it's a contractual arrangement, and it's sort of, as far as I can tell, developed organically through the tax exempt sector. This is something that sort of developed, has been applied in different ways. It was never created by statute. It's never been created in law. It's just something that operationally has developed in the nonprofit sector.
And I'm saying, obviously, I guess I don't know whether it's obvious or not, but the IRS permitted this to go on,
Yeah, certainly they've
approved it,
acquiesced to it.
sanctioned it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So has use of them increased?
Yes, certainly. And it's hard to tell, it's hard to tell exact numbers because there's no fiscal sponsorship registry, right? Nobody goes out and registers, I am a fiscal sponsor, you get this full list, but you can tell that the practice has increased. It really seems, and this is anecdotal based on my research, but um, seems like they really started getting going, through the 70s and 80s. Groups like Tides started accelerating more through the 1990s, even more through the 2000s. And then reporting has said that it's even accelerated even since 2020, just in the last few years. So I think, as far as I can tell, there seems to be sort of almost an exponential growth in it that has increased as time has gone on. It's increased faster, and certainly there are, without question, hundreds of fiscal sponsors out there. Could be as many, could be thousands out there. Um, yes, it's increased.
There's a fiscal sponsor business, essentially, as it were. Uh,
Sure,
can start a C3 to be a fiscal sponsor for other groups.
sure, that does happen. There are groups that exist out there. Their charitable purpose is to provide fiscal sponsorship.
Yeah. And now what are the benefits of fiscal sponsorship? I assume you're going to say incubation, but if I'm a donor who wants to support a group that does not have C3 status, the people who are looking for support will say, well, how about through this fiscal sponsor? And at the beginning, it was sort of for the time being, right? But what are the benefits? Is that a benefit, the primary one? What might describe
Yeah.
that benefit, and what might some of the other benefits be?
Primary benefit, I think, as advertised, you might say, would be incubation. So a group wants to start up. They don't have it in the operational capacity to do all the administrative back office stuff right away. They get that benefit from the fiscal sponsor. Um, it's faster and cheaper to become a fiscally sponsored project than it is to become a tax exempt nonprofit. And if you want to get funded right away, right, if there's a 501(c)(3) institutional grant maker like a foundation, they need to give to an established C3, and doing it through a fiscal sponsorship allows them to do that quickly. So I'd say those would be the advertised benefits. You might say there's a bit of a transparency, lack of transparency benefit if that's what you're after
Oh,
to fiscal
so it's
sponsorship,
funny. I didn't, yeah, that could either be in the drawbacks or the benefit. If I'm looking for,
depending on how you view it.
yeah, okay. All right. So discuss that.
So fiscal, this was kind of the crux of the article I wrote in that the transparency framework, you might say, around fiscal sponsorship, despite being tax exempt, because that's the whole point, right? You're underneath the tax exempt nonprofit. Despite that, there is no transparency around fiscal sponsorship. The whole disclosure transparency setup we have for the tax exempt sector in the United States, principally through Form 990, which is the annual return, that does not exist for fiscal sponsorships, either as a standalone, in a standalone sense, or as a part of that Form 990 from the sponsor. So, very much less disclosure for a fiscally sponsored project for its financials, operations, everything like that.
So just to be skeptical, though not cynical, if I'm a donor, we can even make me a private foundation looking to very much preferring to make a grant to a C3 than directly to a person, though that'd be doable. You'd pay more taxes and so on. It might be the case that I also, don't want people to know what I'm funding. So I'll give it to that fiscal sponsor, who will then sponsor the group or project to do something with which I, the funder, original, wouldn't be connected.
Yeah, and just so folks, listeners understand exactly how this would work, if you said you were the private foundation, you would have to report that grant. All foundations, all nonprofits report their domestic grants above a certain threshold. You would see that grant going to the fiscal sponsor, the nonprofit. Um, but then there's a question, and this depends on the particular reporting practices of that grant maker, whether you would see the next level down, right? That you would see the fiscally sponsored projects. You might say Foundation A gives to nonprofit B, and that's it. Or you might see Foundation A gives to nonprofit B for the purpose of supporting fiscally sponsored project C. But that's ad hoc and it's inconsistent reporting.
And of course, if you're the skeptical or cynical person, and I'm the skeptical or cynical original grant maker, I'm free to not provide much detail there. I just gave it to group, the fiscal sponsor, group tax exempt, and I'm covered. That's all we need to do, all the law requires.
I think that's if you read the IRS instructions for Form 990 and Form 990 PF, I think that might be questionable. When they say you're instructed to provide a description of the grant. It's a grant description you have to
Mhm.
provide. And they do say, in detail, they don't, it's not just say, general. A lot of places do that, but I
You
don't
will.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure you're supposed to do that in terms of at least the spirit of the disclosure framework.
Okay, and then let's just put ourselves, now I'm the fiscal sponsor, will make me. What am I supposed to? I file a 990 because I'm a C3.
Mhm.
What do I have to put in there about whom? But am I a donor, by the way? Your write-up calls me, the fiscal sponsor, a donor because money, I'm giving money. Or that's the question. Am I a
So
donor?
that
I'm a fiscal sponsor.
if you're the fiscal sponsor, the answer of whether you're a donor or not depends on what kind of fiscal sponsorship we have set up. We didn't talk about this, but I think we mentioned it, but there's different types. I mean, they're called, there's Model A, there's Model C are the two big ones. And these come from a book, a seminal work on the topic, Gregory Colvin's book. Um, where Model A fiscal sponsorship, which is what we're really wanting to talk about, I think, which this is the project housed within the nonprofit. But if you're a Model C fiscal sponsor, which is more of a grant making thing, those grants do get disclosed. At least in some instances they do. So I guess the fiscal sponsor in that case, Model C, would be a grant maker because you would show on Schedule I, Fractured Atlas does this. They're a major nonprofit Model C fiscal sponsor, and they've got the whole list of grants that they make in their Model C fiscal sponsorship. But if you're talking about Model A, the comprehensive project housed, no, you would report nothing. You're not the grant maker. It's a program underneath you.
You're going to correct me and tell me this will freak people out. It's kind of a pass through. Fair?
Yes, I think it's a pass through to a program. Yeah, I
Mhm.
think
Mhm.
you could
That
see
I,
it
as the
that
fiscal
way.
sponsor, am supposed to be sort of overseeing and making sure they're not violating the law to cover the rear end of the original giver, be it a private foundation or whomever. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. Do
As
they?
fiscal sponsor, you are responsible for ensuring that that money is spent for the exempt purposes, certainly.
So we're describing what, depending on your viewpoint, is either a drawback or a benefit. Are there any other abuses? If that's an abuse, is that an abuse? And are there any other?
Is it an abuse? That's a very good question. It's certainly the framework we have. So in that sense, it's not, I mean, there's no illegality going on. So in that sense, it's not an abuse. But I think the transparency could be improved for the spirit of what we're trying to talk about, right? So that's kind of the crux of what I was getting at with the article is what sort of transparency things should we require of fiscal sponsorship that get more at the spirit of what we want to require of the tax exempt sector. Um, Whether or not to characterize that as an abuse is,
Well, it's a way around the 69 Act's structure, isn't it?
yeah.
And the understanding of what some call the grand bargain there, like DAFs, which some people would see as well, a way around, a workaround.
Mhm.
Uh, okay, you're agreeing with that? I'm dragging you along.
I think it's a way, or I would agree that as fiscal sponsorship is currently practiced and reported, it does not fulfill the grand bargain transparency angle that we've
Yeah.
set up. Yes.
Who uses fiscal sponsorship more, the right or the left, in policy-oriented grant making? If that's a determinable number. If
Um,
speculate, feel
yeah,
free.
speculate. I'm going to say the left does it, but could be a function of the nature of Capital Research Center and my research, what I've looked at. I feel comfortable saying that it's a core it's core to the understanding of what we at the Capital Research Center do and write about to understand fiscal sponsorship. It's that common. It's something we see all the time. And so the fact that it's become that common for the sorts of groups we look at, which are principally left of center public policy oriented C3s and C4s, that should tell you something, I think.
Mhm. The biggest fiscal sponsors would be, this is a question, Tides, or is Tides
Tides,
just a good example? They're also the biggest monetarily, uh, which is,
Tides, Arabella, yeah, sort of the ones. Those would be the two big left of center ideological ones you would talk about.
well,
Yeah.
there must be right-wing ones too, no?
Sure, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure fiscal sponsorship does. I mean, the one that gets thrown out as an example is Donors Trust, of course. This is a major donor advised fund provider, conservative donor advised fund provider.
Well, but that's not a fiscal sponsor.
They
Oh,
do fiscal sponsorship, though.
okay, okay.
It's just a very minor part of what they do based on their 990s. They're overwhelmingly a DAF provider. They do offer fiscal sponsorship service, but if they're reporting on the 990, it's a fraction of their activities.
And by the way, an even bigger fraction of Tide's fiscal sponsorship mechanism and Arabella's, that's a question. I
Yeah.
mean,
So
yeah,
Tides, yeah, the Tides network, which is multiple entities, this was originally under the Tides Foundation, which still exists, and they do Model C fiscal sponsorship, but the real fiscal sponsorship core of Tides is something called the Tides Center. It was spun off, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. They house, that's where I think over 100, I think, projects are currently housed. Arabella does it through the New Venture Fund, through the Hopewell Fund, Windward 1630, multiple nonprofit fiscal sponsors under that Arabella management framework. Arabella and Tides would be the two you would point to as examples of this sort of fiscal sponsorship on the left.